Dr. Alina Vasquez pulled her lab coat tighter as she walked through the empty corridors of the Marine Research Center. It was past midnight, but she preferred working when the world was quiet. No chattering colleagues, no pointless meetings, no reminders of how disappointing people could be. At 42, Lena had built her entire career around studying the tiniest creatures in the ocean. While others looked at the vast blue sea and saw beauty, she saw something far more fascinating. Under her microscope, single-celled organisms that had survived for billions of years, perfectly adapted to their world, never changing what worked. Unlike humans, she muttered to herself as she switched on her equipment. The news radio in the corner was talking about another political scandal, another environmental disaster, another senseless conflict somewhere in the world. She reached over and turned it off with more force than necessary. Elena's laboratory was her sanctuary. Rows of microscopes, carefully labeled samples, and walls lined with research papers about marine microorganisms. Her colleagues often joked that she knew more about tiny sea creatures than she did about people. They weren't wrong, and Alina didn't mind. People were complicated in all the wrong ways. She had good reasons for feeling this way. Growing up, she watched her parents tear each other apart with cruel words and broken promises. Their marriage ended when she was 16, leaving her with a deep skepticism about human relationships. Even at university, she saw professors backstab each other for research funding. Students cheat on exams and administrators care more about money than actual learning. But the ocean was different. Under her microscope, Alina found a world where everything made sense. Tiny organisms moved with purpose, adapted to challenges, and survived through pure intelligence. No drama, no lies, no betrayal, just perfect, elegant existence. Her research assistant, David, often tried to draw her into conversations about weekend plans or office gossip. Alina would politely deflect, returning her attention to her specimens. David was nice enough always, offering to help with experiments and bringing her coffee during long research sessions. But Alina had learned not to get too attached to people. They always disappointed you in the end. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a human, studying life, while having very little faith in human life itself. Now, she'd published dozens of papers on how microscopic organisms demonstrated perfect cooperation, flawless adaptation, and elegant problem-solving. Yet she couldn't find those same qualities in her own species. Elena's breakthrough. Research focused on how single-celled marine organisms communicated with each other. She discovered that these tiny creatures could send chemical signals, work together to find food, and even sacrifice themselves for the survival of their group. It was beautiful, a sophisticated behavior that put human society to shame. Look. At this, she would tell David, pointing to images of organisms working together under the microscope. Perfect cooperation. No ego, no selfishness, just pure intelligence working toward survival. David would nod politely, but Alina could see the question in his eyes. If these microscopic creatures were so perfect, why did she seem so unhappy? Why did someone who studied life seem so disconnected from living? The truth was, Alina had convinced herself that humans were evolutionary failures. While her microscopic subjects had remained unchanged for millions of years because they were already perfect, humans kept making the same mistakes over and over. Wars, pollution, greed, hatred. She'd seen enough of it to last a lifetime. Her office walls were covered with images of beautiful microscopic organisms, but not a single photo of family or friends. Alina had attended exactly 3 social events in the past 5 years, and only because they were mandatory faculty gatherings. She'd stand in the corner, counting the minutes until she could escape back to her laboratory. Even her few attempts at romantic relationships had failed. Alina approached dating like she approached research, looking for logical patterns and predictable behavior. But people weren't logical. They were messy, emotional, and unpredictable. After her last relationship ended 2 years ago, she'd decided that solitude was simply more efficient. Humans are the only species that actively works against its own survival, she would write in her research notes. Unlike the organisms I study, we seem incapable of true cooperation or intelligent adaptation. Alina's daily routine reflected this philosophy. She arrived at the lab before sunrise, worked through lunch, and left long after sunset. Weekends were spent reading research papers or organizing her specimen collection. She'd convinced herself that this was the life of a serious scientist, but deep down, she knew she was hiding. The Marine Research Center where she worked was filled with passionate scientists who genuinely cared about protecting the ocean. They organized beach cleanups, lobbied for environmental protection, worked tirelessly to educate the public about marine conservation. Lena respected their work but couldn't understand their optimism about humanity's capacity for change. Right there. Fighting a losing battle, she would tell herself while watching colleagues prepare for another public education event. Humans will never learn to protect what they don't understand. As Elena prepared her equipment for another late-night research session, she had no idea that her entire worldview was about to be challenged. The microscopic world she'd used to judge humanity was about to teach her something completely unexpected about her own species. She pulled a new set of samples from the storage unit. Specimens collected from a remote Pacific research station. Just another routine analysis, or so she thought. Elena had no way of knowing that these particular samples would contain something that would force her to reconsider everything she believed about human nature. The clock on the wall ticked past 1 in the morning as Elena began her work, completely unaware that she was about to discover something that would change not just her research, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be human. Elena rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her third cup of coffee. The clock showed 3:47 a.m., but she was wide awake. Something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the unusual samples that had arrived from the remote Pacific research station. Or maybe it was just her scientist's intuition telling her that discovery was in the air. She carefully placed the first sample slide under her microscope and adjusted the focus. At first, everything looked normal. The usual collection of marine microorganisms swam across her field of view, their familiar dance bringing her the same comfort it always did. Tiny creatures moving with purpose, each one perfectly adapted to its environment, but then she saw something that made her pause. Mixed in with the expected marine life were cells that looked completely out of place. They were larger than the typical ocean organisms, and their movement patterns were unlike anything she'd seen before. Lena frowned and adjusted the magnification. These weren't supposed to be here. Contamination, she muttered, assuming someone at the research station had accidentally mixed samples. It happens sometimes, especially with remote collection teams working in difficult conditions. She made a note to contact the station later and ask about their collection procedures. But as Elena prepared to move on to the next sample, something caught her attention. These contaminating cells weren't just randomly floating around. They were moving with incredible purpose and coordination. She watched, mesmerized. As they navigated through the sample with what could only be described as intelligence, Elena had spent 20 years studying microscopic life, and she'd never seen anything like this. These cells were working together in ways that reminded her of her most sophisticated marine subjects. They formed organized groups, communicated through what appeared to be chemical signals, responded to obstacles with remarkable problem-solving abilities. She leaned closer to the microscope, her heart rate increasing. The cells were human, reproductive cells, but they were behaving in ways that defied everything she knew about human biology. Instead of the simple, straightforward swimming she expected, these cells demonstrated complex collective behavior that seemed almost intelligent. This can't be right, Elena whispered to herself. She carefully removed the slide and prepared a fresh sample from the same collection bottle. If this was contamination, it should show up inconsistently. But as she focused the microscope on the new slide, the same phenomena appeared. The cells moved like tiny swimmers with a mission. They navigated chemical gradients with precision, formed protective formations around damaged companions, and even seemed to sacrifice themselves to clear paths for others. Elena watched in amazement as they demonstrated cooperation that rivaled the most advanced marine organisms she'd ever studied. What struck her most was their resilience. These microscopic swimmers faced acidic conditions, temperature changes, and chemical barriers that should have stopped them completely. Instead, they adapted with a sophistication that made Alina question everything she thought she knew about human biology. She spent the next hour preparing slide after slide, each one confirming what she was seeing. This wasn't a fluke or contamination. These cells were consistently demonstrating behavior that suggested a level of intelligence and cooperation that Alina had only seen in the most evolved marine species. "David is going to think I've lost my mind," she said to the empty laboratory. But she couldn't deny what she was observing. Her years of training had taught her to trust her data. Even when it challenged her assumptions, Alina began taking detailed notes, documenting the cells' movement patterns, their responses to different chemical environments, and their apparent communication methods. The more she observed, the more amazed she became. These weren't just biological machines following simple programming. They were demonstrating conscious-like behavior at a microscopic level. She watched as individual cells would alter their swimming patterns to help struggling companions navigate difficult terrain. She saw them form complex geometric patterns that seemed to serve strategic purposes. Most remarkably, she observed them making what appeared to be calculated sacrifices, with some cells deliberately exhausting themselves to create easier paths for others. The implications were staggering. If human cells could demonstrate this level of sophisticated behavior, what did that say about the conscious beings they were designed to create? Alina felt a strange sensation she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement about a discovery that involved human biology. For someone who had spent decades convinced that humans were primitive compared to marine organisms, this was a revelation that shook her to her core. She was looking at human cells that displayed the same elegant intelligence she'd always admired in ocean. Microorganisms. As dawn began to break outside her laboratory windows, Alina realized she hadn't moved from her microscope in over 4 hours. Her neck was stiff, her eyes were dry, but her mind was racing with possibilities. These microscopic swimmers were forcing her to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human nature. She picked up her phone to call David, then hesitated. How could she explain what she'd discovered? How could she tell someone that human reproductive cells were demonstrating the same sophisticated behaviors she'd been praising in marine organisms for 20 years? Alina looked back through the microscope one more time, watching the cells continue their remarkable dance of cooperation and adaptation. For the first time in her career, she was seeing human biology not as primitive machinery, but as something approaching the elegance she'd always found in the ocean's smallest inhabitants. Discovery was going to change everything. Alina just didn't know how much yet. Alina couldn't sleep. For 3 days straight, she'd been returning to the laboratory before sunrise, driven by an obsession she'd never felt before. The discovery of those remarkable microscopic swimmers had turned her orderly world upside down, and she needed answers. She'd always prided herself on being a logical scientist who followed evidence wherever it led. But this evidence was leading her somewhere she'd never expected to go. Every new observation challenged another assumption she'd held about human nature. David arrived at the lab that morning to find Alina already hunched over her microscope, surrounded by dozens of sample slides and pages of handwritten notes. Her usually perfect lab coat was wrinkled. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that suggested she'd been there all night. "Double quotes, Dr. Vasquez? Did you sleep here again?" David asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee. Alina looked up, blinking in the fluorescent light. "These cells, David, they're not just swimming randomly. They're solving problems. Watch this." She gestured for him to look through the microscope. David had worked with Alina for 2 years, and he'd never seen her this excited about anything. Usually she was calm, controlled, almost detached from her work. But now she was practically vibrating with energy. "I've been testing them under different conditions," Alina continued, pointing to her notes: chemical barriers, temperature changes, pH variations. "These microscopic swimmers adapt to everything I throw at them. But it's not just adaptation, David. It's intelligent adaptation." Over the next several hours, Alina showed David observation after observation. The cells didn't just respond to obstacles. They seemed to anticipate them. They formed protective groups around weaker members, shared resources in ways that suggested complex communication. and even appeared to learn from previous challenges. "Look at this," Alina said, switching to a fresh slide. "I introduced a mild chemical stressor yesterday. The first group of cells took almost an hour to develop an effective response. But when I introduced the same stressor to a new group today, they adapted in just minutes. It's like they're sharing information." David watched in amazement as the cells moved with purpose and coordination that seemed almost impossible for such tiny organisms. "How is this possible? I mean, these are just individual cells, right?" "That's what I thought," Alina replied. "But I'm beginning to think we've been looking at this all wrong. These aren't just individual cells acting independently. They're part of a system, a collective intelligence that's far more sophisticated than we ever imagined." Alina's research took on a new urgency. She began reaching out to colleagues she'd barely spoken to in years, asking questions about cellular communication, collective behavior, and biological intelligence. For someone who had spent decades working alone, she found herself craving collaboration. Dr. Peterson, from the psychology department, was the first to respond to her unusual request for a meeting. Alina had always avoided interdisciplinary work, but now she needed perspectives from outside her field. "What you're describing sounds like emergent behavior," Dr. Peterson explained during their coffee meeting. "Individual units following simple rules that create complex, intelligent-seeming behavior at the group level. We see it in ant colonies, bird flocks, even human crowds." Alina nodded, furiously taking notes. "But this feels different. These cells aren't just following simple rules. They're making decisions, adapting strategies, even showing what looks like emotional responses to stress." "Emotional responses?" Dr. Peterson leaned forward, intrigued. "Watch their movement patterns when I introduce environmental stressors," Alina said, pulling up video footage on her laptop. "Some cells actually slow down and cluster together, almost like they're comforting each other. Others become more aggressive, pushing forward despite obstacles. It's like they have personalities." As Alina shared her findings with more colleagues, she began to see connections she'd never noticed before. The cooperation she observed in her microscopic swimmers reflected patterns she'd studied in marine ecosystems. But more importantly, it reflected patterns she'd been blind to in human society. Dr. Kim, from anthropology, pointed out that the protective behaviors Alina documented in her cells mirrored the way human communities respond to threats. "You're seeing the same fundamental patterns that drive human cooperation," she explained. "Protection of the vulnerable, resource sharing, collective problem solving." Alina felt something shift inside her chest. For 20 years, she'd been studying these exact behaviors in marine organisms and calling them beautiful, sophisticated, and elegant. But when she saw the same behaviors in humans, she'd dismissed them as primitive and flawed. "I think I've been looking at this backwards," Alina admitted during a late-night research session. She was alone in the lab again, but this time she didn't feel isolated. She felt connected to something larger, something she was only beginning to understand. Her research journal from this period reveals a scientist in the midst of a profound transformation. "If this level of intelligence and cooperation exists, at the cellular level," she wrote, "what does that say about the conscious beings these cells are designed to create? Have I been underestimating human potential all along?" Alina began to pay attention to the people around her in ways she never had before. She noticed how David consistently stayed late to help with experiments, never asking for recognition. She observed how her colleagues shared resources, collaborated on projects, and supported each other through professional challenges. For the first time in years, Alina began to see human behavior not as evidence of primitive thinking, but as complex, adaptive responses to challenging environments. The microscopic swimmers had become more than just a research subject. They had become a window into understanding the sophisticated intelligence that existed at every level of human existence. As she prepared to delve even deeper into her research, Alina realized that she wasn't just studying cells anymore. She was studying the fundamental building blocks of human potential. Alina stood in front of her bathroom mirror, hardly recognizing the person staring back at her. For the first time in months, she was getting ready for a social event. The annual Marine Biology Conference was something she'd attended for years, but always as an obligation. This time felt different. This time, She actually wanted to be there. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of discovery that extended far beyond her microscopic swimmers. Alina was beginning to see connections everywhere, patterns that had been invisible to her for decades. It was like putting on glasses after years of living with blurred vision. David had noticed the change immediately. "You seem different lately," he'd said during their morning coffee ritual. "More ... I don't know, present." Alina had laughed, surprising them both. When was the last time she'd laughed at work? "I think I'm finally understanding something I should have seen years ago," she'd replied. The conference was being held at a hotel downtown, and Alina found herself actually looking forward to the networking sessions she'd always dreaded. As she walked through the crowded lobby, she observed the interactions around her with new eyes. Scientists from around the world were greeting each other, sharing research, and collaborating on projects that none of them could accomplish alone. "It's just like the cells," she whispered to herself. Watching a group of researchers from different institutions huddled around a laptop, excitedly discussing data, Dr. Chen from the University of Hawaii waved her over to join a conversation about ocean acidification. Normally, Alina would have politely declined and found a quiet corner to review her presentation notes. Instead, she found herself walking over, genuinely curious about what they were discussing. "Alina, we were just talking about your research." "On microbial communication," Dr. Chen said. "I've been following your work for years. The way you describe cellular cooperation reminds me of what we're seeing in coral reef recovery." As Alina listened to Dr. Chen explain how damaged coral reefs were rebuilding themselves through complex community interactions, she felt that familiar spark of recognition. The same patterns she'd observed in her microscopic swimmers were playing out on a massive scale in ocean ecosystems. The individual coral polyps sacrifice their own resources to help struggling neighbors, Dr. Chen continued. They share nutrients, provide protection, and even communicate chemical warnings about threats. "It's like they understand that their survival depends on the health of the whole community." Lena nodded, remembering her own observations. "I've seen the same thing in my cellular research. Individual cells making sacrifices for the group, sharing resources, adapting their behavior based on what others need." The conversation continued for over an hour, with more researchers joining in. Alina found herself contributing ideas, asking questions, and genuinely enjoying the collaborative exchange. This was what she'd been missing all these years while hiding in her laboratory. Later that evening, Alina called her sister for the first time in 3 years. The conversation had been awkward at first, with both of them unsure how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But instead of focusing on past disappointments, Alina found herself curious about her sister's life. "I've been thinking about you lately," Alina said. "About how you've managed to raise 3 kids while working full-time? That takes incredible coordination and sacrifice." Her sister was quiet for a moment. "I never thought of it that way. Most days I just feel like I'm barely keeping everything together." "But that's exactly what I mean," Alina replied. "You're constantly adapting, problem-solving, putting their needs before your own. It's like the most sophisticated biological system I've ever studied." The conversation flowed more naturally after that. Alina learned about her nephew's struggles in school, her niece's passion for art, and her sister's new job at a non-profit organization. Instead of seeing these as mundane human problems, Alina began to recognize them as examples of the same complex adaptive behaviors she'd been studying. Back at the laboratory, Alina's research took on new dimensions. She began collaborating with colleagues from other departments, something she'd never done before. Dr. Williams from psychology helped her understand how the stress responses she observed in cells might relate to human emotional reactions. Dr. Jackson from sociology provided insights into how individual actions contributed to collective behavior. "You know what's interesting?" Dr. Williams said during one of their joint research sessions. "The cellular cooperation you're documenting mirrors what we see in human communities during crisis situations. People instinctively organize, share resources, and make personal sacrifices for the greater good." Lena nodded, thinking about the recent earthquake in a nearby city. She'd watched news coverage of neighbors helping neighbors, strangers sharing food and shelter, and entire communities working together to rebuild. At the time, she'd been impressed but hadn't connected it to her research. It's the same intelligence operating at different scales, Alina realized. From cells to individuals to communities, the same principles of cooperation and adaptation apply. David had been watching Elena's transformation with quiet amazement. She'd started including him in research decisions, asking for his opinions, and even sharing personal stories during their coffee breaks. The distant, cynical scientist he'd worked with for 2 years was becoming someone warmer, more connected. "I owe you an apology," Alina said to him one afternoon. "I've been so focused on what I thought was wrong with people that I missed what was right with them. You've been showing me kindness and cooperation every day, and I just... didn't see it." David smiled. "You're seeing it now. That's what matters." Elena's research notes from this period reveal a scientist grappling with profound personal change. "I spent years convinced that humans were failures compared to the organisms I studied," she wrote. "But I was comparing apples to oranges. Humans aren't failed microorganisms. They're successful, complex organisms operating at a completely different level of organization." As Alina prepared for the next phase of her research, she realized that her microscopic swimmers had given her more than just scientific insights. They'd given her a new way of seeing the world and her place in it. It's the same intelligence and cooperation she'd always admired in marine life was all around her, in every human interaction, every community effort, every act of kindness. For the first time in years, Alina felt genuinely excited about being human. Alina adjusted her microphone and looked out at the packed auditorium. 600 scientists from around the world had gathered to hear her presentation at the International Conference on Biological Intelligence. A year ago, she would have been terrified by such a large audience. Today, she felt energized by the opportunity to share what she'd learned. 12 months ago, I believed that humans were evolutionary failures," Alina began, her voice steady and clear. "I thought we were crude, primitive beings who couldn't match the elegant intelligence of microscopic organisms. I was wrong." A murmur rippled through the audience. Alina smiled, remembering how David had coached her on public speaking. "Be honest," he'd said. "Tell them your story. People connect with truth, not just data." Alina clicked to her first slide, showing microscopic swimmers moving in perfect coordination. "What you're seeing here changed everything I thought I knew about human nature. These cells demonstrated intelligence, cooperation, and sacrifice that I'd only seen in the most advanced marine organisms I'd studied for 20 years. She walked across the stage, feeling more comfortable in front of people than she ever had before. The past year had been a journey of discovery that went far beyond her laboratory walls. Alina had learned to see the world through new eyes, and she wanted to share that vision with others. "But the real breakthrough wasn't in my microscope," Alina continued. "It was in my mirror. I realized that I'd been studying human intelligence all along, just at a different scale. The same cooperation, adaptation, and sophisticated problem-solving I admired in cells was happening all around me in human communities." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. Alina had never felt such a strong connection with other people. She thought about her research team, now grown to 12 members from different disciplines. Each person brought unique skills and perspectives that made their collective work stronger than any individual effort. "Let me give you an example," Alina said, clicking to a new slide. "When I first observed these cells forming protective barriers around damaged companions, I was amazed by their altruism. But then I started noticing the same behavior in my own workplace. Colleagues staying late to help struggling team members, sharing resources without being asked, adapting their work to support the group's success." Alina paused, thinking about her sister. Their relationship had completely transformed over the past year. What had started as an awkward phone call had become weekly video chats where they shared their lives, supported each other through challenges, and celebrated each other's successes. "I used to think that human emotion was a weakness," Alina admitted. "I saw it as primitive, chaotic, inefficient. But my research taught me that emotion is actually a sophisticated communication system. It's just like my microscopic swimmers use chemical signals to coordinate behavior. Humans use emotional signals to build cooperation and strengthen social bonds." The presentation continued for another 30 minutes. with Alina sharing specific examples of how her cellular research had applications in fertility treatment, autism research, and understanding collective decision-making. But the heart of her talk was about recognizing the intelligence that existed at every level of human experience. During the question and answer session, Dr. Martinez from Spain raised her hand. Dr. Vasquez, your research suggests that individual human actions contribute to collective intelligence. How do you think this applies to solving global challenges like climate change? Alina nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly what I've been working on with my expanded research team. We're studying how individual behavioral changes can create cascading effects in larger systems. Just like my microscopic swimmers adapt their behavior based on environmental signals, human communities can adapt to environmental challenges when they receive clear information and see others taking action. After the presentation, Alina was surrounded by colleagues wanting to discuss collaborations, share their own research, and explore new ideas. She found herself energized by these interactions instead of drained by them. The woman who had once hidden in her laboratory now thrived on human connection. That evening, Alina had dinner with David and several colleagues who had become genuine friends over the past year. As she looked around the table, listening to animated discussions about research projects and future collaborations, she felt a profound sense of belonging. You know what's funny? Alina said during a lull in the conversation. I spent so many years studying life while feeling disconnected from living. These microscopic swimmers taught me that I wasn't separate from the intelligence I was studying. I was part of it. David smiled. You've certainly become part of a lot more than you used to be. This research team, the conference circuit, your family relationships. You're like a cell that finally found its organism, Alina laughed. That's probably the most accurate scientific metaphor anyone's ever made about my personal life. 6 months after the conference, Alina stood in her laboratory, now buzzing with activity from her research team. Students and postdocs from around the world had come to study microscopic intelligence and its applications to human behavior. The work had practical implications that extended far beyond academic research. Their findings were being used to improve team dynamics in hospitals, design better educational programs, and even help city planners create more cooperative communities. Alina had never imagined that her microscopic swimmers would have such wide-ranging impact on human society. Dr. Vasquez called Jake, one of her newest research assistants. The sample from the Arctic station just arrived. Are you ready to see what we find? Alina walked over to the microscope, feeling the familiar thrill of discovery. But now it was accompanied by something else. Genuine excitement about what these findings might reveal about human potential. As she focused the microscope on the new sample, Alina reflected on her journey. She'd started as a cynical scientist who believed humans were primitive failures. She'd become a collaborative researcher who recognized the sophisticated intelligence inherent in human nature at every level. What do you see? David asked, joining her at the microscope. Alina looked up, her eyes bright with possibility. I see the same beautiful complexity I've always loved about life. I just understand now that we're all part of it, the microscopic. Swimmers continued their elegant dance under the lens, reminding Alina that intelligence, cooperation, and adaptation weren't just qualities to be studied. They were qualities to be lived.